By the close of the 1960s, the American automobile industry was facing a challenge it had not anticipated. Fuel prices were climbing. A generation of younger consumers was turning away from the heavy, powerful muscle cars that had defined the previous decade and turning towards something smaller, lighter, and more economical. European and Japanese manufacturers, particularly Volkswagen with its ubiquitous Beetle, were filling that demand with vehicles American companies had largely ignored. Ford Motor Company recognized the threat. Its existing lineup offered little in the way of compact, fuel-efficient options. A response was needed, and it was needed quickly. In 1970, after just 2 years of research and development, roughly half the time a new vehicle model would ordinarily require, Ford introduced the Pinto. The compressed development timeline was itself a decision that would carry consequences. The Pinto was positioned as everything the American market was asking for. It was small, it was light, approximately half the weight of Ford's standard models, which translated directly into improved fuel efficiency. And it was priced accessibly at $2,000 new, equivalent to roughly $16,000 in today's currency.
Ford invested heavily in the launch. Henry Ford II was photographed driving the vehicle through Detroit. Television campaigns ran extensively. The message was consistent. The Pinto was a practical, affordable, distinctly American alternative to the foreign compact. The market responded. Within the first 2 years, Ford sold 800,000 units. By any commercial measure, the Pinto appeared to be exactly what the company had hoped for. But the vehicle carried a structural flaw, one that had been identified during the design process and not adequately resolved.
In May of 1972, a woman named Lily Gray was driving her Pinto when the vehicle stalled. Attempting to move out of the path of traffic, she was struck from behind. The impact, by any reasonable standard, should have produced minor damage. Instead, the vehicle caught fire. The cause traced back to a fundamental compromise made during the Pinto's compressed development. In the effort to reduce the vehicle's overall length and weight, the rear of the car had been significantly shortened. The fuel tank had been positioned directly behind the rear bumper, with minimal structural protection between them.
In a rear-end collision, even a low-speed one, sharp metal components could puncture the tank. Fuel would spill. A single spark was sufficient. Lily Gray's accident was not an isolated event. It was the first documented case in what would become a pattern spanning years. Pintos involved in rear-end collisions were catching fire at a rate that drew attention from safety investigators, journalists, and eventually the public.
By the late 1970s, more than 100 lawsuits had been filed by victims of Pinto fire incidents. News coverage accumulated steadily. The vehicle's name became shorthand in late-night programming, in editorial cartoons, in everyday conversation, for corporate negligence and engineering failure. In 1978, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration ordered the recall of 1.5 million Pinto units. What made the story more than a product failure, what elevated it into a landmark case in the history of corporate ethics, was what emerged through litigation and investigative reporting. Internal Ford documents suggested that the company had been aware of the fuel tank vulnerability. A cost-benefit analysis, which became known as the Pinto Memo, had reportedly weighed the financial cost of modifying the design against the projected cost of settling future injury and death claims. The modification, at an estimated cost of roughly $11 per vehicle, was determined not to be cost-effective. Ford disputed the interpretation of those documents.
The full picture remained contested in courts and in public discourse for years. But the damage to public trust was substantial and lasting. And yet, even after the recall, even after the headlines, Ford sold nearly 200,000 Pinto units in 1979 and 1980. The episode raised an uncomfortable question that extended well beyond one vehicle. How much risk will consumers accept in exchange for a lower price?
While the Pinto's safety record was generating headlines on American roads, a separate chapter of its history was unfolding several thousand feet above the California landscape. Henry Smolinski was an aeronautical engineer with an idea that, on paper, represented the next logical step in personal transportation. The flying car had been a concept discussed since the early days of both aviation and the automobile. Smolinski believed the time had come to make it practical.
His approach was economical. Rather than designing an entirely new vehicle from the ground up, he would adapt an existing production car, one that was affordable, widely available, and light enough to meet aviation requirements. He selected the Ford Pinto. Smolinski's design married the rear half of a Cessna Skymaster, including its wings, tail assembly, and engine, to a standard Ford Pinto body. The integrated vehicle could, in theory, be driven to an airstrip, attach to the aerial components, fly to a destination, detach, and continue as a conventional automobile. He named the resulting prototype the Mizar, after a star in the constellation Ursa Major.
Investor interest followed. Before the vehicle had completed a single successful test flight, Smolinski had secured 35 pre-orders. In August of 1973, the Mizar's first flight test was conducted, with a processional test pilot at the controls. The vehicle reached takeoff speed, lifted off the runway, and climbed to approximately 120 feet. At that altitude, one of the wing struts failed. The test pilot executed an emergency landing in a field below. He survived. The vehicle sustained damage. Smolinski reviewed the results, made modifications, and scheduled a second test. His regular pilot was unavailable. Smolinski elected to take the controls himself. On a clear morning in September 1973, Smolinski and his business partner took off for the second trial. The Mizar climbed to 400 feet under what appeared to be controlled flight. The same wing strut failed again. The aircraft went down. Both occupants were killed on impact. The subsequent investigation determined that the Pinto's body, despite being among the lightest vehicles in production, was still too heavy for the wing assembly Smolinski had attached to it. It also determined that the strut, which had failed on the first test flight, had never been properly repaired before the second. The dream of a mass-market flying car, built around the Ford Pinto, ended on that airstrip in California. The broader question, whether the Pinto's notorious fuel tank vulnerability had played any role in the crash, was never definitively answered. The Ford Pinto was not the first time the automobile industry had built known danger into a product and sold it to an enthusiastic public. Decades earlier, a different innovation had made outdoor rear seating standard on some of America's most popular vehicles. By the 1920s, the automobile had moved from novelty to necessity across much of the United States. Among younger, more affluent consumers, the vehicle of choice was the coupe, sleek in profile, quick in performance, and designed for 2 or 3 occupants seated in the front. The coupe's limitation was its capacity. Social life in the 1920s placed a premium on mobility and company. 2 seats were, on many occasions, not enough.
The solution that emerged was already built into the vehicle. Behind the coupe's body, beneath a hinged panel at the rear, sat a folding seat, tucked away when not in use, deployable when additional passengers were needed. When opened, it provided seating for 2 more occupants, positioned entirely outside the enclosed cabin, exposed to the open air.
The appeal was genuine. The experience of riding in the open air, elevated above the road, offered a sensation that enclosed cabin seating could not replicate. It was novel. For many passengers, it was exhilarating. What it was not, by any modern standard, was safe. The rumble seat positioned its occupants directly over the rear axle, where road vibration was most intense. There was no meaningful shock absorption. The experience in practice earned the seat its name. The jostling and rattling of the unpaved and poorly maintained roads of the era produced exactly the sensation the word suggests.
The name it acquired in popular culture was more pointed. It was frequently called the mother-in-law seat, a sardonic acknowledgement that the position was one you might offer to a guest whose comfort you were, perhaps, not entirely prioritizing. The safety realities were not concealed. Newspaper coverage of rumble seat accidents was common throughout the era. At highway speeds that could reach 57 miles per hour, on roads with minimal traffic regulation and no mandatory safety standards, an occupant of the rumble seat who was ejected in a collision, or who remained in position when a vehicle overturned, faced consequences with little structural protection.
Despite that, the rumble seat remained in production for decades. When Ford introduced the Model A in 1929, its best-selling vehicle of the era, the rumble seat was included as a standard feature. The 1957 Ford Thunderbird offered a variant it marketed as the bird's nest. It was not until the late 1960s, when federal safety regulation began to establish enforceable standards for vehicle occupant protection, that the open rear seat finally disappeared from American automobile production. The rumble seat's persistence across 40 years of known risk offers a consistent lesson, one the Pinto would reinforce decades later. The gap between knowing a product carries danger and removing that danger from the market is rarely closed by awareness alone.
The Ford Pinto and the rumble seat occupied different eras in the history of the American automobile. They were separated by decades, by technology, and by the regulatory environment in which each was produced. What connects them is more fundamental than the products themselves. In both cases, a design decision with known safety implications was brought to market and sustained there by consumer demand, by commercial calculation, or by the simple momentum of a product that was selling. In both cases, the consequences were absorbed not by the manufacturers, but by the people who used what had been built for them. The history of consumer safety is, in large part, the history of those consequences accumulating until the gap between what was known and what was done about it could no longer be maintained.